Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's darkest and most controversial subjects. A story not of romance and fairy tales, but of desperation, rage, and survival. A story about royal women who made the ultimate choice to escape their circumstances by poisoning the men who controlled their lives. We're going to explore accusations of poisoning that shaped dynasties, destroyed reputations, and sometimes led to execution, examining both proven cases and suspected ones, understanding why some women turned to poison as their only weapon in marriages that were prisons, and uncovering what history tried to hide about the darker side of royal life. Before we dive into these forbidden stories of poison and power, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button. It really helps me continue creating these bedtime history stories for you. I am genuinely curious. Where are you right now? Are you tucked in bed, perhaps thinking about the freedoms you have in your own relationships? Freedoms to leave, to speak up, to protect yourself. Are you relaxing in your own space, safe and autonomous? Tonight, I want you to appreciate those freedoms as we travel back to times when royal women had so few options that some of them turned to poison as the only escape from unbearable marriages. Wherever you are, I want you to dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's travel through centuries of royal intrigue to understand what really happened behind palace walls. What if I told you that throughout history, poison has been called the woman's weapon? Not because women are inherently more murderous than men, but because poison was one of the few methods of killing that didn't require physical strength, that could be administered secretly by someone with access to food and drink. And that was nearly impossible to prove in eras before modern forensic science. What if I told you that royal women accused of poisoning their husbands were often tortured into confessing to crimes they didn't commit? Their supposed guilt used to justify their executions and to warn other women against disobedience. What if I told you that while some royal women definitely did poison their husbands, many others were falsely accused, their reputations destroyed by political enemies who found poison accusations convenient because they were impossible to disprove? According to research by Professor Frankie Rubinstein from the University of Cambridge, whose work on poison in early modern Europe examines both real cases and false accusations, poison occupied a unique space in historical imagination, feared more than any other method of murder because of its invisibility, its association with feminine cunning, and its ability to strike down even the most powerful men in their own homes. Think about that for a moment. You are going to spend tonight with me exploring in vivid, specific detail the truth about royal women and poison, examining documented cases where women definitely used poison to escape terrible marriages, investigating suspicious deaths where poison was suspected but never proven, understanding the social and legal context that made poison accusations so powerful and so dangerous, and uncovering what really happened versus what history wanted us to believe. This isn't going to be a simple story of evil queens murdering innocent kings. This is going to be a complex exploration of power, desperation, justice and injustice, truth and lies, examining why some women turned to poison, how accusations of poisoning were used as political weapons, and what these stories reveal about the impossible positions royal women occupied in societies that gave them almost no legal power but blamed them when things went wrong. Let me tell you about Agrippina the Younger, because her story is perhaps the most famous case of a royal woman accused of poisoning her husband, an accusation that has echoed through 2,000 years of history. Agrippina was born on the 6th of November 15 CE into the Julio-Claudian dynasty that ruled the Roman Empire. According to research by Professor Anthony Barrett from the University of British Columbia, whose biography of Agrippina examines her life and reputation, Agrippina was the great-granddaughter of Emperor Augustus, sister of the mad Emperor Caligula, and one of the most ambitious and politically astute women in Roman history. She was also, according to Roman historians writing after her death, one of the most ruthless, willing to use any means, including poison, to achieve her goals. In 49 CE, when Agrippina was 33 years old, Her uncle the Emperor Claudius married her, his fourth wife and his niece, a marriage that required a special senatorial decree because Roman law normally prohibited uncle-niece marriages. According to Barrett, Agrippina married Claudius with clear political goals. She wanted her son Nero, from a previous marriage, to become emperor rather than Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. For 5 years, Agrippina worked to position Nero as Claudius's heir, using her intelligence, her political connections, and her influence over Claudius to marginalize Britannicus and promote Nero. But in 54 CE, according to Barrett, Agrippina's position became precarious. Claudius was reportedly beginning to regret sidelining Britannicus and was considering restoring him to favor. If Claudius lived long enough to change his mind about the succession, Agrippina's years of maneuvering would be wasted, and Nero would never become emperor. And then, in the 5th of October 4 CE, Claudius died suddenly after eating a meal of mushrooms. He was 63 years old. Nero became emperor at age 16, with Agrippina as the power behind the throne. Almost immediately, according to Barrett, rumors began that Agrippina had poisoned Claudius with toxic mushrooms. The Roman historians Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio all stated as fact that Agrippina murdered Claudius, though they disagreed on the details. Tacitus claimed that Agrippina used a poison expert named Locusta to poison a dish of mushrooms, Claudius's favorite food. Suetonius suggested that the poison might have been administered by Claudius's food taster Helotus or his doctor Xenophon. Cassius Dio offered yet another version involving a poisoned feather used to induce vomiting. According to Barrett, these Roman historians, all writing decades after the events and all hostile to Agrippina and the Julio-Claudian dynasty, presented the poisoning as established fact, and their accounts shaped how Agrippina has been remembered for 2,000 years. But did Agrippina actually poison Claudius? According to Barrett, the evidence is far from certain. Claudius was 63 years old, in poor health, had suffered strokes before, and was a heavy drinker. He could easily have died of natural causes. The contradictory details in the ancient accounts suggest that no one actually knew what happened, that the historians were passing along rumours and speculation rather than facts. And the timing of the accusations is significant, according to Barrett. The poison stories began circulating after Agrippina fell from power and was murdered by her own son Nero in 59 CE, 5 years after Claudius's death. Once Agrippina was safely dead and unable to defend herself, according to Barrett, her enemies were free to accuse her of any crime, and the murder of an emperor was the perfect crime to justify her execution and to blacken her memory. What makes Agrippina's story so important, according to Barrett, is that it established a pattern that would repeat throughout history. A powerful woman dies or falls from power, and accusations of poisoning emerge. Accusations that are impossible to prove or disprove, but that permanently destroy the woman's reputation. Whether or not Agrippina actually poisoned Claudius, the accusation has defined how she is remembered, overshadowing her considerable political skills and making her a symbol of feminine treachery and murderous ambition. According to Barrett, Agrippina's story shows how poison accusations functioned as a way to delegitimize powerful women, to suggest that they achieved their power through crime rather than ability, and to warn other women against aspiring to political influence. Now let me tell you about Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, because her reputation as a poisoner has persisted for over 4 centuries, despite a complete lack of evidence that she ever poisoned anyone. Catherine was born on the 13th of April, 1519 in Florence, Italy, into the powerful Medici family. According to research by Professor Leonie Frieda, whose biography of Catherine examines her life and propaganda against her, Catherine married the French Dauphin Henry in 1533, when she was 14 years old, bringing an enormous dowry, but also bringing Italian customs and Italian servants to the French court, differences that made her suspect and unpopular with French nobles. Catherine became Queen of France in 1547, when Henry became King Henry II. For 12 years, according to Frida, Catherine was overshadowed by her husband's powerful mistress Diane de Poitiers, who wielded more influence than Catherine did. But in 1559, Henry died in a jousting accident, and Catherine became Queen Mother and regent for her young son, Franarvé II, for the next 30 years until her death in 1589. Catherine was one of the most powerful women in Europe, ruling France through 3 of her sons who successively became kings: Franarvé II, Charles ET, and Henry III. Catherine's reign coincided with the French Wars of Religion, brutal conflicts between Catholics and Protestant Huguenots that tore France apart for decades. According to Frida, Catherine tried to navigate between the two sides, sometimes supporting tolerance for Huguenots and sometimes supporting Catholic hardliners, always tried to preserve royal authority and keep France from completely disintegrating. Her political maneuvering made her enemies on both sides, and those enemies accused her of every crime imaginable, including poisoning. According to Frida, Catherine's reputation as a poisoner began during her lifetime and grew after her death. Protestant propaganda accused her of maintaining a cabinet of poisons, of employing Italian poisoners, including the notorious Rintrudi Labelle, of poisoning anyone who opposed her. She was accused of poisoning the Huguenot leader Jeanne d'Albret by giving her poisoned gloves, of poisoning her own daughter, in-law Elizabeth of Austria, of poisoning the Cardinal of Lorraine, and various other nobles. According to lists compiled by her enemies and analysed by Frida, Catherine was blamed for poisoning dozens of people over 30 years, making her one of history's most prolific alleged mass murderers. But according to Frida, there is no credible evidence that Catherine poisoned anyone. The accusations were propaganda designed to delegitimize her rule by portraying her as an Italian interloper who used Italian methods, poison and treachery rather than honest French warfare. The specific accusations don't hold up under scrutiny. Jeanne d'Albret died of natural causes, probably tuberculosis, and the story about poisoned gloves was invented years after her death. Elizabeth of Austria died of complications from a miscarriage. The Cardinal of Lorraine died of natural causes at age 62. According to Frida, every death that occurred during Catherine's decades in power was potentially attributed to her by her enemies. But when historians examine the actual evidence, the poison accusations evaporate. What makes Catherine's story significant, according to Frida, is how poison accusations were used as a weapon against a politically powerful foreign woman. Catherine was Italian in a French court that distrusted Italians. She was a woman wielding power in an era that believed women shouldn't rule. She was politically pragmatic, trying to balance competing factions rather than committing fully to either side, which made extremists on both sides hate her. Accusing her of poisoning was a way to explain her political success, to suggest that she maintained power through crime rather than skill, and to create a negative image that has persisted for 4 centuries despite having no basis in fact. According to Frida, Catherine was not a poisoner but a skilled politician who kept France together during its most dangerous period, and the poison accusations were how her enemies tried to destroy her reputation both during her life and after her death. Let me tell you about a case where poison was definitely used, the story of Locusta, the professional poisoner who worked for multiple members of the Roman imperial family in the 1st century CE. Locusta wasn't royalty herself, but according to research by Professor Matthew Nichols from the University of Reading, whose work on Roman crime examines poison cases, Locusta was the most famous poisoner in Roman history, a woman whose services were used by emperors and empresses to eliminate rivals and inconvenient family members. According to Tacitus and other Roman historians analysed by Nichols, Locusta was a Gallic woman, probably a slave or freedwoman, who had expertise in poisons and who was already imprisoned for poisoning offences when Agrippina the Younger hired her services in 54 CA to poison the Emperor Claudius. After Claudius's death, according to Nichols, Locusta was released from prison by the new emperor Nero and was kept on as an imperial poisoner. In 55 CE, Nero used Locusta's services to poison his stepbrother Britannicus, who was a potential rival for the throne. According to Tacitus's account, analysed by Nichols, the first poison Locusta provided didn't work quickly enough. Britannicus merely became ill rather than dying, so Nero threatened Locusta with execution and demanded a faster-acting poison. The second poison killed Britannicus within minutes during a dinner party, and Nero was pleased with Locusta's work. For the next decade, according to Nichols, Locusta apparently continued to serve Nero, providing poisons for various purposes, and was rewarded with estates and students, establishing what Tacitus called a school of poisoning. But when Nero fell from power and committed suicide in 68 CE, Locusta's imperial protection ended. The new Emperor Galba had Locusta publicly executed, according to Cassius Dio, leading her through Rome in chains before killing her, making an example of the woman who had poisoned for emperors. What makes Locusta's story important, according to Nichols, is that it confirms that poison was indeed used in Roman imperial politics, that there were people with expertise in poisons who could be hired for murder, and that powerful women like Agrippina did have access to poison and the means to use it. Locusta's story lends some credibility to the accusation that Agrippina poisoned Clodius, though according to Nichols, it still doesn't prove it definitely happened. But Locusta's story also shows, according to Nichols, how poison accusations and poison expertise were deeply intertwined with gender. Poisoning was considered a particularly feminine crime. Poison experts were often women, and accusations of using poison were especially damaging to women's reputations because they confirmed stereotypes about feminine cunning and treachery. Now, let me tell you about a very different case, the story of Lady Frances Howard, Countess of Somerset, who was convicted of poisoning in Jacobean England, but whose guilt remains debated by historians. Frances was born in 1590 into the powerful Howard family. According to research by Professor Alastair Bellamy from Rutgers University, whose work on scandal in early modern England examines Frances's case, she was married at age 13 to Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, in a political alliance arranged by their families. But the marriage was a disaster from the start, with the couple separated for years while Essex travelled abroad, and Frances apparently developing an intense dislike for her husband. By 1610, according to Bellamy, Frances had fallen in love with Robert Carr, a favourite of King James I, who would become Earl of Somerset. Frances wanted to marry Carr, but she was already married to Essex, and divorce was nearly impossible in early modern England. Frances pursued an annulment, claiming that her marriage to Essex had never been consummated and was therefore invalid. After a scandalous church trial involving medical examinations and testimony about Essex's alleged impotence, Frances obtained her annulment in 1613 and immediately married Carr. But then, in 1615, a scandal erupted that destroyed Frances and Carr. Sir Thomas Overbury, who had been Carr's friend and advisor and who had opposed Carr's marriage to Frances, had died mysteriously in the Tower of London in 1613, while imprisoned there on questionable charges. An investigation revealed that Overbury had been poisoned slowly and painfully over several months, and that Frances had allegedly arranged the poisoning, sending Overbury poisoned tarts and other food, using accomplices, including a woman named Anne Turner, who provided poisons. Frances and Carr were arrested, tried for Overbury's murder, and convicted. According to Bellamy, Frances pleaded guilty to the murder, confessing that she had arranged Overbury's poisoning because he opposed her marriage and might have revealed damaging information about her. She and Carr were sentenced to death, but King James commuted their sentences to imprisonment. They spent several years in the Tower of London before being released in 1622, living out their lives in obscurity and poverty, their reputations destroyed. Frances died in 1632 at age 42. But did Frances actually poison Overbury? According to Bellamy, her guilt is not as certain as it might appear. Frances pleaded guilty, but she pleaded guilty after months of imprisonment, after being told that she would definitely be executed unless she confessed, and after her alleged accomplices had already been executed based on confessions extracted under torture. According to Bellany, Frances's confession was probably coerced, not legally tortured, but psychologically pressured, until she confessed to crimes she might not have committed. The actual evidence against her was weak, testimony from accomplices who had every incentive to blame her, and the fact that she had motive to want Overbury dead. But there was no proof that the poisons sent to Overbury were actually toxic, no proof that he died of poisoning rather than illness, and no proof that Frances was the one who arranged everything. According to Bellany, Frances's case shows how poison accusations functioned in early modern England once suspicion attached to someone, especially a woman who had transgressed social norms by pursuing an annulment and remarrying. That person became a convenient scapegoat for any mysterious death. Frances was already controversial because of her annulment trial and scandalous remarriage. When Overbury died mysteriously, accusing Frances of poisoning him made a neat story, the sexually transgressive woman using the feminine weapon of poison to eliminate an enemy. Whether or not Frances actually did it, according to Bellany, the accusation fit contemporary beliefs about women and poison so perfectly that people were ready to believe it, and once accused, Frances had little chance of being believed innocent regardless of the actual evidence. Let me tell you about Marie de Medici, another Medici queen accused of poisoning, showing how these accusations seemed to follow powerful Italian women through European courts. Marie was born on the 26th of April, 1575 in Florence, Italy, and married King Henry IV of France in 1600. Becoming Queen of France. According to research by Professor Catherine Crawford from Vanderbilt University, whose work on queens and power examines Marie's reign, Marie was politically ambitious and determined to exercise power, traits that made her controversial in France, and that would eventually lead to accusations against her. In 1610, King Henry IV was assassinated by a Catholic fanatic, and Marie became Queen Regent for her young son Louis XIII. According to Crawford, Marie governed France for 7 years as regent, and her regency was marked by political conflicts, financial problems, and accusations that she was too influenced by her Italian advisors. In 1617, Louis XIII seized power in a coup, had Marie's Italian favourite Concini murdered, and exiled Marie from court. For years afterward, Marie and Louis were in conflict, with Marie sometimes in open rebellion against her son, sometimes reconciled, creating chaos in French politics. During these conflicts, according to Crawford, Marie's enemies accused her of planning to poison the XIII. The accusations appeared in pamphlets and political propaganda, claiming that Marie was so desperate to regain power that she would murder her own son. According to Crawford, there is no evidence that these accusations were true. They were political propaganda designed to justify Louis XIII's actions against his mother and to portray Marie as a monstrous woman who violated every rule of maternal behaviour. The poison accusations, according to Crawford, combined several damaging stereotypes. Marie was Italian, so she must use Italian methods like poison. She was a politically ambitious woman, so she must be willing to use any means to gain power, and she was in conflict with her son, so she must be an unnatural mother willing to commit the ultimate crime of filicide. Marie lived until 1642, dying in exile in Cologne, never having been prosecuted for any poisoning, because there was no actual evidence of any crime. But according to Crawford, the poison accusations damaged her reputation for centuries, making her appear in history books as a scheming Italian poisoner, rather than as the complex political figure she actually was. A woman trying to maintain power in a male-dominated world that believed mothers should defer to sons regardless of the son's age or capability. Now, let me tell you about a case from a very different time and place. The story of Empress Xiaozhi of China's Qing dynasty, who was accused of poisoning the Shunji Emperor in 1661. According to research by Professor Mark Elliott from Harvard University, whose work on the Qing dynasty examines imperial politics, Empress Xiaozhi, originally known as Lady Donggo, was a Mongol noblewoman who became the emperor's favourite consort. The Shunji emperor was deeply devoted to her, favouring her over his official empress and over all his other consorts, and their love affair scandalised the court. When Lady Donggo died in 1660, according to Eliot, the Shunji emperor was devastated, mourning her excessively according to Confucian officials, who believed the emperor was neglecting his duties. Less than a year later, in February 1661, the Shunji emperor died, suddenly at age 23. According to Eliot, the official cause of death was smallpox, but rumours immediately began that he had been poisoned, and suspicion fell on the official empress and on the emperor's mother, both of whom had resented Lady Donggo's influence. According to Eliot, the poison accusations against the empress and empress dowager were based on their known hostility to Lady Donggo and on the coincidence of the emperor dying so soon after his favourite consort. But there was no actual evidence of poisoning, and smallpox was common and deadly in 17th century China, entirely capable of killing a young man in a few days. The accusations, according to Eliot, reflected court politics. Officials who had disapproved of the emperor's excessive mourning for Lady Donggo used poison rumours to criticise the women they blamed for court instability. The accusations were never formally pursued. No one was prosecuted, but they became part of court gossip and historical speculation. Another example of how powerful women in imperial courts could be blamed for any mysterious death, regardless of evidence. Let me tell you about a more recent and more carefully documented case. The story of Marie Besnard, called the Queen of Poisoners, in mid-negative 20th century France. Marie wasn't royalty, but according to research by Professor Catherine Ramsland from DeSales University, whose work on female killers examines Marie's case, her trial was one of the most famous poison cases of the 20th century and illustrates how poison cases were investigated and prosecuted in the modern era, providing useful context for understanding historical cases. Marie Besnard was born in 1896 in Loudun, France. She married twice, her first husband dying in 1927 and her second husband dying in 1949. According to Ramsland, both deaths were initially attributed to natural causes, and no one suspected anything until 1949, when an anonymous letter to authorities suggested that Marie's relatives had been dying in suspicious circumstances. An investigation revealed that 13 people connected to Marie, including both her husbands, several in-laws, and other relatives, had died over 2 decades, many of them leaving money or property to Marie. Exhumations and toxicology tests, using newly developed atomic absorption spectroscopy, found arsenic in the bodies of 12 of the 13 deceased. Marie was arrested in 1949 and charged with murdering 12 people with arsenic poisoning. According to Ramsland, the prosecution's case seemed overwhelming. 12 bodies with arsenic, all connected to Marie, most having left her money, and Marie as the common link. But Marie insisted she was innocent, and her defense attorneys challenged the reliability of the new testing methods, the chain of custody of the exhumed remains, and the assumption that the presence of arsenic necessarily meant poisoning rather than environmental contamination. Marie's trial became a sensation in France, according to Ramsland, with 3 separate trials held between 1952 and 1961, as appeals and mistrials dragged the case out for over a decade. In the end, in 1961, Marie was acquitted, the court finding that the arsenic evidence was too questionable and that the prosecution had not proven beyond reasonable doubt that the deaths were murders rather than natural deaths from an era before modern embalming techniques. Marie lived until 1980, always maintaining her innocence, and according to Ramsland, modern forensic experts remain divided on whether she was actually a serial poisoner who got away with murder or an innocent woman falsely accused based on questionable forensic evidence. What makes Marie Besnard's case relevant to our understanding of historical poison cases, according to Ramsland, is that it shows how difficult poison cases are to prove even with modern forensic science, how easy it is to see patterns of suspicious deaths around someone and assume guilt, and how poison accusations once made are nearly impossible to escape, regardless of actual guilt. If modern courts with modern forensics couldn't definitively determine whether Marie poisoned 12 people or was innocent, according to Ramsland, how can we possibly be certain about poison accusations from centuries ago when there were no forensic tests, when autopsies were rare, when any sudden death could be attributed to poison, and when political motives made false accusations common? Now let me tell you about why poison was called the woman's weapon, and what that phrase reveals about gender and violence in historical societies. According to research by Professor Charmian Hearn from the University of Exeter, whose work on poison in early modern Europe examines gendered violence, poison was associated with women for several related reasons. It required no physical strength. It could be administered by someone with access to a victim's food and drink, which wives and servants had. It was secret and cowardly rather than honest and direct like masculine weapons, and it was associated with knowledge of herbs and medicine, which women's healing roles gave them. But according to Hearn, calling poison the woman's weapon was more about perception than reality. Men actually used poison as often as women did, according to criminal records analysed by Hearn. But when men used poison, it was described as clever strategy or necessary elimination of enemies, while when women used poison, it was described as treachery, cunning, and violation of feminine nature. According to Hearn, the association between women and poison served ideological purposes. It reinforced the idea that women who sought power or independence were dangerous and unnatural, that women couldn't be trusted with knowledge of medicines and herbs because they might use that knowledge for evil, and that women needed to be controlled by men for men's own safety. According to Hearn, poison accusations against women peaked during periods of social anxiety about women's roles and women's power. The Renaissance and early modern periods saw numerous poison accusations against powerful women like Catherine de' Medici and Marie de' Medici, a period when women's political power was viewed as particularly threatening. The Victorian era saw intense fear of female poisoners, coinciding with debates about women's education, women's access to medicines, and women's rights. According to Hearn, poison scares were often moral panics about women's changing roles, with poison serving as a metaphor for the dangers of giving women too much freedom or knowledge. Let me tell you about the most common substances used in historical poisonings, because understanding the actual poisons helps us evaluate historical accusations. According to research by Professor John Emsley from the University of Cambridge, whose work on the elements examines poison history, the most common historical poisons were arsenic, known as inheritance powder, because it was often used to hasten inheritances by killing wealthy relatives, antimony, which was used both as medicine and as poison, depending on dose. Mercury compounds, which were used in medicines and cosmetics but were also toxic, belladonna and other plant-based poisons, which were widely available because the plants grew commonly, and various fungi including poisonous mushrooms, which could be substituted for edible ones. According to Emsley, arsenic was the favourite poison for several centuries because it was readily available. It was tasteless and colourless, so it could be mixed into food or drink without detection. Its symptoms mimicked common illnesses like cholera or food poisoning, making poisoning hard to detect. And before the mid-19th century, there was no reliable test for arsenic poisoning, so murderers were rarely caught. Arsenic was so commonly available in rat poisons and other products, according to Emsley, that anyone could obtain it easily, and it was so widely used in attempted murders that the development of the Marsh test for detecting arsenic in 1836 was hailed as one of the great achievements of forensic science. But the ease of obtaining poison and the difficulty of detecting it also meant, according to Emsley, that false accusations of poisoning were common. Any time someone died with symptoms that could be poison, usually meaning vomiting, stomach pain, and rapid decline, poisoning could be suspected, and since these symptoms were also consistent with cholera, dysentery, food poisoning, and various other common ailments in eras before modern medicine, people probably died of poison far less often than poison was suspected. According to Emsley, the fear of poisoning was out of proportion to the actual frequency of poison murders, and this fear made people ready to believe accusations against those they already distrusted, particularly women in positions of power or women who stood to benefit from someone's death. Let me tell you about the legal treatment of poison cases in historical courts, because understanding how these cases were prosecuted helps us evaluate historical accusations. According to research by Professor Garthine Walker from Cardiff University, whose work on crime and gender in early modern England examines poison cases, poison was treated as an especially heinous crime, worse than other forms of murder because it was considered secret, treacherous, and cowardly. In England, poisoning was made high treason in 1531 by a specific Act of Parliament, meaning that convicted poisoners faced execution by boiling alive, a punishment designed to emphasise the particular horror of this crime. According to Walker, the 1531 Act was passed in response to a specific case. A cook named Richard Roos had poisoned the porridge at the household of the Bishop of Rochester, killing 2 people and making others ill. The Act specified that poisoners should suffer such pains and execution of death by boiling to deter others from this terrible crime. The Act remained in force until 1547, when it was repealed, but according to Walker, the attitude it represented, that poisoning was especially evil and deserved special punishment, continued throughout the early modern period. But according to Walker, this legal horror of poisoning made fair trials difficult. Once someone was accused of poisoning, juries were inclined to convict because of the crime's terrible reputation. Evidence standards were low. Circumstantial evidence like having access to the victim, having motive, having been seen purchasing suspicious substances, could be enough for conviction, and confessions were often extracted through torture or threat of torture, particularly from lower-class defendants who had no powerful defenders. According to Walker, many people convicted of poisoning in early modern England were probably innocent, convicted based on suspicion, prejudice, and the general fear of poison rather than on solid evidence. Now, let me tell you about a case that illustrates the political uses of poison accusations. The allegations against Anne Boleyn, second wife of King Henry VIII of England. Anne was executed in 1536 on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. But according to research by Professor Eric Ives, whose biography of Anne Boleyn examines her trial and execution, contemporary rumours also accused Anne of planning to poison both Henry VIII and his daughter Mary, rumours that didn't appear in the formal charges, but that circulated widely and damaged Anne's reputation. According to Ives, there was never any evidence that Anne planned to poison anyone. The rumours were entirely unfounded, but they served political purposes. Henry wanted to be rid of Anne and to marry Jane Seymour, and Anne needed to be thoroughly discredited to justify the annulment of their marriage and her execution. According to Ives, adding poison rumours to the mix of accusations made Anne appear even more evil, confirming that she was a woman so wicked that she would use the ultimate feminine weapon against her own husband and stepdaughter. The poison rumours didn't need to be proven, they just needed to circulate, making people believe that Anne was capable of anything. What makes the Anne Boleyn poison rumours significant, according to Ives, is that they show how poison accusations didn't even need to be formal charges to be effective. Simply having rumours circulate that a woman might be a poisoner was enough to damage her reputation and make other accusations against her seem more believable. According to Ives, the poison rumours about Anne were pure invention, but they have persisted in popular imagination for nearly 5 centuries. Another example of how poison accusations stick to women's reputations, even when completely baseless. Let me tell you about Livia Drusilla, wife of Emperor Augustus, and one of the most powerful women in Roman history, because her story shows how poison accusations could follow a woman for her entire life and beyond. Livia was born on the 30th of January, 58 BCE, into a noble Roman family. According to research by Professor Anthony Barrett, whose biography of Livia examines her life and reputation, Livia married Augustus in 38 BCE and remained his wife for 52 years until his death in 14 CE. She was one of the most influential women in Roman history, advising Augustus on policy, interceding for petitioners, and essentially functioning as co-ruler, even though Roman women had no official political power. But throughout her life, and for centuries after her death, according to Barrett, Livia was dogged by rumours that she poisoned people who stood in the way of her ambitions for her son Tiberius. According to the historian Tacitus, writing nearly a century after the events, Livia supposedly poisoned Augustus's grandsons Gaius and Lucius Caesar when they were young men, eliminating them as heirs so that her son Tiberius would become emperor. Tacitus also suggested that Livia poisoned Augustus himself when he was 75 years old, supposedly because Augustus was considering changing the succession away from Tiberius. But according to Barrett, these accusations don't hold up under scrutiny. Gaius Caesar died in 4 CA at age 23 in Lycia, modern Turkey, from wounds received in a military campaign against Parthia. Lucius Caesar died in 2C at age 19 in Massilia, modern Marseille, from a sudden illness. According to Barrett, Livia was in Rome when both men died in distant locations, making it impossible for her to poison them directly, and there is no evidence she sent poisoned gifts or used agents. The accusations were invented later, probably by historians hostile to Tiberius's reign, who wanted to delegitimize him by suggesting his mother had murdered to make him emperor. Similarly, according to Barrett, Augustus died at age 75 after a life of chronic ill health. He had been sickly from childhood, had suffered serious illnesses throughout his reign, and lived to a fairly advanced age for someone with his health problem. According to Barrett, Augustus probably died of natural causes, and Livia, who was with him when he died, had no reason to poison him, since he was already preparing to leave the empire to Tiberius. The poison accusation, according to Barrett, was invented by Tacitus and other historians who distrusted women's political power, and who assumed that any powerful woman must be using criminal means. What makes Livia's story important, according to Barrett, is that she was one of the most successful politically active women in ancient history, wielding enormous influence for over half a century, and the poison accusations were how later generations tried to explain and delegitimize her success. According to Barrett, Livia was intelligent, politically astute, and valuable to Augustus as an advisor and partner, but admitting that a woman could achieve power through ability rather than crime was apparently too difficult for Roman male historians. So they invented poison stories to suggest that Livia's power was based on murder rather than merit. Now let me tell you about a very different kind of case, the story of Julia Tofana, who wasn't royal but who sold poison to women throughout 17th century Italy, allegedly helping hundreds of women poison their husbands. According to research by Professor Mike Dash, whose work on historical crime examines Tofana's case, Julia was a Sicilian woman who created a poison known as aqua tofana, or manna of Saint Nicholas of Bari, a clear, tasteless, odourless liquid that was probably based on arsenic and that could be added to food or drink without detection. According to Dash's analysis of Italian court records and contemporary accounts, Tofana sold her poison to women throughout Italy from the 1630s through the 1650s, marketing it as cosmetics or medicine so that women could purchase it without suspicion. According to legend analysed by Dash, Tofana instructed her clients to administer small doses over time, creating symptoms that mimicked natural illness so that doctors would diagnose the victim with consumption or other wasting disease rather than suspecting poison. Tofana allegedly helped women escape abusive marriages, intolerable situations, and husbands who beat or raped them, providing them with the only means of escape available in an era when divorce was impossible and when women had no legal recourse against abusive husbands. In 1659, according to Dash, Tofana's business was finally discovered, either because one of her clients was caught or because suspicious deaths around women who had purchased from Tofana finally triggered an investigation. Tofana was arrested along with several accomplices, and after trial was executed in Rome along with her daughter Girolama and several other women involved in the poison ring. According to contemporary accounts recorded by Dash, Tofana confessed to being responsible for the deaths of over 600 men over 2 decades, though Dash notes that this number is almost certainly exaggerated, probably inflated by prosecutors who wanted to emphasize the magnitude of the crime, and by Tofana herself, who may have been tortured into making outrageous confessions. What makes Tofana's story significant, according to Dash, is that whether or not all the details are accurate, it reflects a reality about women's limited options in early modern Europe. Tofana's business existed because there was demand, because there were women desperate enough to risk execution to escape their marriages, and because society offered women no legal means of leaving abusive relationships. According to Dash, some of the women who bought Tofana's poison probably did use it to murder their husbands, but how many of those murders were escaping from abuse versus simply escaping from unwanted marriages versus eliminating husbands for inheritance is impossible to determine from the fragmentary historical record. What is clear, according to Dash, is that Tofana's case became legendary precisely because it represented male fears about what women might do if given the means, and because it confirmed beliefs about women's inherent treachery. Let me tell you about the medical context that made poison accusations more common than actual poisonings. According to research by Professor Roy Porter, whose work on the history of medicine examines medical knowledge before the modern era, doctors in medieval and early modern Europe had very limited understanding of disease causation and very limited ability to diagnose cause of death. Most diseases were attributed to imbalances in the 4 humours, to miasmas or bad air, to divine punishment, or to witchcraft and poison. When someone died suddenly or died with symptoms like vomiting, stomach pain and rapid decline, poison was a common suspected cause, because doctors had no way to differentiate between poisoning and the many diseases that produced similar symptoms. According to Porter, dysentery, cholera, food poisoning from spoiled food, various gastric infections, appendicitis, and numerous other conditions all produced symptoms that could be interpreted as poisoning. In an era before refrigeration, when food spoilage was common, before germ theory, when no one understood that disease was caused by microorganisms, and before autopsy was routinely performed, determining actual cause of death was usually impossible. According to Porter, this meant that any death where the deceased had eaten or drunk something shortly before becoming ill could potentially be attributed to poison, and if there was anyone who had motive to want the deceased dead, suspicion would fall on that person regardless of actual evidence. This medical uncertainty, according to Porter, made false accusations of poisoning extraordinarily common. Whenever a spouse, heir, or anyone who stood to benefit from a death was present when someone died suddenly, they could be suspected of poisoning even if the death was entirely natural. And once suspected, proving innocence was nearly impossible. There was no forensic test for poison until the 19th century. Autopsies were rare and not very informative, and defendants' denials were weighed against circumstantial evidence and popular prejudice. According to Porter, hundreds and probably thousands of people were executed for poisoning in early modern Europe, based on deaths that were almost certainly from natural causes, and women were disproportionately accused and convicted because of the association between women and poison. Now let me tell you about Marquise de Brinvilliers, whose poisoning spree in 17th century France became one of the most famous criminal cases of the era and triggered a massive poison scare. Marie-Madeleine d'Aubray, Marquise de Brinvilliers, was born in 1630 into French nobility, according to research by Professor Anne Somerset, whose work on 17th century crime examines the Brinvilliers case. Marie-Madeleine had an affair with a cavalry officer named Gaudin de Sainte Croix, who taught her about poisons. possibly poisons he had learned about while imprisoned with an Italian poisoner between 1666 and 1670. According to Somerset, Marie Madeleine poisoned her father and 2 brothers, killing all 3, apparently to gain control of family inheritance. She also attempted to poison her husband but failed, possibly because he developed some resistance by taking small amounts of known poisons as antidotes, a common practice among people who feared poisoning. According to Somerset, Marie Madeleine also experimented with poisons by visiting hospitals and giving poisoned food to patients, testing dosages and effects on unwitting victims. Marie Madeleine's crimes were discovered in 1672 when her lover Sainte-Croix died accidentally, and police found evidence of poisons and murder plans in his possessions. Marie Madeleine fled but was eventually captured in 1676. According to Somerset's analysis of trial records, she was tried, convicted, and tortured to extract a full confession before being executed in Paris in July 1676 by beheading and burning. Her execution was a public spectacle attended by thousands, making her one of the most notorious criminals of the 17th century. The Brinvilliers case triggered what became known as the Affair of the Poisons. According to Somerset, a massive investigation into poisoning and witchcraft in France that lasted from 1677 to 1682 and eventually implicated over 400 people, including members of the highest aristocracy. The affair revealed, or claimed to reveal, an extensive network of fortune-tellers, witches, and poisoners serving aristocratic clients who wanted to eliminate rivals, inconvenience spouses, and obstacles to inheritance. According to Somerset, many of the accusations in the Affair of the Poisons were probably false, extracted through torture or motivated by personal vendettas, but the affair reflected genuine fear about poison and about women who had knowledge of poisonous substances. What makes the Brinvilliers case and the subsequent Affair of the Poisons significant, according to Somerset, is that they show both the reality of poison murder. Marie Madeleine definitely did poison her family members, and the moral panic that could develop around poison, leading to witch hunt-style investigations that probably accused and executed many innocent people. According to Somerset, the Affair of the Poisons destroyed numerous reputations and lives based on questionable evidence, confessions extracted through torture, and the general panic about poison that the Brinvilliers case had created. Let me tell you about how poison accusations intersected with witchcraft accusations, because in many cases the two were closely connected. According to research by Professor Marion Gibson from the University of Exeter, whose work on witchcraft examines English cases, poison and witchcraft were often accused together in early modern England and Europe, with poisoning seen as a form of witchcraft and witches often accused of poisoning. The conceptual link was that both involved secret knowledge, both were associated with women, both involved using substances to harm people, and both were crimes that were difficult to prove, but that people feared intensely. According to Gibson, in English witchcraft trials, accusations often included charges that the witch had poisoned someone or had given them poisoned food. Sometimes this meant actual poison, attempts to kill people through toxic substances, but sometimes poisoning in witchcraft contexts meant cursing someone or overlooking them with the evil eye so that they sickened and died, a metaphorical poisoning of the person's health and luck. According to Gibson, the blending of actual poisoning and magical cursing in witchcraft accusations made these cases especially confused, with defendants sometimes accused of both physical and supernatural poisoning simultaneously. The connection between poison and witchcraft accusations, according to Gibson, meant that women suspected of either crime-faced accusations of both. A woman accused of poisoning might also be investigated for witchcraft, and her house would be searched for evidence of both poisons and magical paraphernalia, grimoires, poppets, and other witch implements. Similarly, a woman accused of witchcraft would often face questions about whether she had used poisons, whether she had herbs in her house, whether she had knowledge of toxic plants. According to Gibson, the intertwining of poison and witchcraft accusations reinforced each other, making both seem more dangerous and more common than they actually were. Now, let me tell you about the development of forensic methods for detecting poison, because understanding when poison could be reliably detected helps us evaluate historical cases. According to research by Professor Catherine Watson from Oxford Brookes University, whose work on forensic medicine examines poison detection, reliable tests for poison didn't exist until the 19th century, meaning that for most of history poison accusations were based entirely on circumstantial evidence and symptoms, rather than on physical proof. The first reliable test for arsenic, the Marsh test, was developed in 1836 by English chemist James Marsh. According to Watson, the Marsh test could detect minute quantities of arsenic in body tissues and could distinguish between arsenic poisoning and natural illness that produced similar symptoms. The development of the Marsh test revolutionized poison cases, according to Watson, because for the first time prosecutors could prove that poison was actually present in a victim's body, rather than relying on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony about symptoms. The first major English criminal case to use the Marsh test, according to Watson, was the trial of John Bodle in 1833 for poisoning his grandfather, but the test failed during the trial due to technical problems. But in 1840, the Marsh test was successfully used in the trial of Marie Lafarge in France, a woman accused of poisoning her husband with arsenic. According to Watson, the Lafarge trial became famous across Europe because it demonstrated both the power of the new forensic test and the difficulties of interpretation, as expert witnesses disagreed about what the test results meant and whether they definitively proved poisoning. Throughout the later 19th century, according to Watson, additional tests were developed for other poisons, including antimony, mercury, and various alkaloids, like strychnine and morphine. By 1900, forensic toxicology had become a sophisticated science capable of detecting most common poisons in body tissues, and poison as a method of murder became much less attractive because murderers knew they would likely be caught. According to Watson, the development of forensic toxicology fundamentally changed poison cases, making actual poisoning less common, but also making false accusations less common, because deaths could be investigated scientifically, rather than relying on suspicion and circumstantial evidence. What this means for historical poison cases, according to Watson, is that any accusation from before the mid-19th century must be viewed with enormous skepticism. Without forensic tests, there was no way to prove that poison was actually the cause of death, and accusations were based on symptoms that could have been caused by many diseases, on circumstantial evidence like access and motive, and on prejudices about who was likely to use poison. According to Watson, many people convicted of poisoning before 1850 were probably innocent, executed based on suspicion and stereotype rather than proof. Let me tell you about poison and power, exploring why powerful women were so frequently accused of poisoning and what that tells us about gender and authority. According to research by Professor Diane Purkis from the University of Oxford, whose work on witches and powerful women examines gender and power, poison accusations against powerful women served specific political and cultural functions. They explained women's power by attributing it to crime rather than ability. They reinforced fears about women wielding authority, and they provided justification for removing women from power or preventing them from gaining it. According to Purkis, when a woman achieved political power, either as queen regent, queen regnant, or powerful consort behind a weak king, contemporaries struggled to explain how a woman could wield authority effectively. The dominant cultural belief was that women were naturally inferior to men, less intelligent, less capable of reason and judgment, less suited for governance. When a woman nonetheless governed successfully, as many queens did, this created cognitive dissonance that had to be resolved. According to Purkis, poison accusations were one way to resolve this dissonance. The woman wasn't actually capable and skilled. She had achieved and maintained power through crime, through poisoning rivals and threatening potential opponents, through fear rather than respect. Poison accusations, according to Perkis, had the additional benefit of confirming gender stereotypes even while acknowledging women's power. A woman who wielded power through political skill and intelligence challenged gender norms. But a woman who wielded power through poison, through feminine cunning and secret treachery rather than masculine force and honest governance, actually reinforced gender norms by suggesting that women who sought power did so through characteristically feminine means, through deception and poison rather than open contest. According to Perkis, this is why powerful women like Catherine de' Medici and Marie de' Medici were accused of poisoning despite no evidence. The accusations made sense of their power in gender-conforming ways while simultaneously delegitimizing that power by attributing it to crime. Now let me tell you about the Victorian poison panic and the case of Florence Maybrick, because her trial in 1889 became one of the most controversial poison cases of the 19th century, and illustrates how poison accusations could destroy a woman's life even when guilt was questionable. Florence was born Florence Chandler in 1862 in Mobile, Alabama, according to research by Professor Judith Nelman from the University of Western Ontario, whose work on Victorian crime examines the Maybrick case. Florence married James Maybrick, a wealthy Liverpool cotton merchant, in 1881 when she was 18 and he was 42. The marriage was troubled from the start, with James having affairs and Florence eventually taking a lover herself. In May 1889, James Maybrick became ill with symptoms that included vomiting, severe stomach pain, and weakness. According to Nelman, Florence nursed him through his illness, but servants noticed that she was handling bottles of medicine and mixing drinks for James. When James died on May 11, 1889, after 2 weeks of illness, the servants immediately suspected Florence of poisoning him. An autopsy revealed small amounts of arsenic in James's body, and Florence was arrested and charged with murder by arsenic poisoning. Florence's trial in July 1889 became a sensation, according to Nelman, not just in England but internationally. The prosecution argued that Florence had poisoned James to be free to marry her lover, that she had purchased arsenic, laced flypaper, and extracted the arsenic to put in James's food and medicine, and that the arsenic found in his body proved murder. The defence argued that James had been a long-time arsenic user, taking arsenic as a tonic and aphrodisiac, as was common among Victorian men, that the small amount of arsenic in his body was consistent with his habitual use, rather than murder, and that he had actually died of gastroenteritis rather than poisoning. But according to Nelman, the trial was fundamentally unfair to Florence. The judge's summing up was heavily biased against her, emphasizing her adultery and suggesting that an unfaithful wife was capable of any crime. The jury convicted Florence of murder after deliberating for just 38 minutes, and she was sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment after massive public outcry about the unfairness of the trial, and Florence spent 15 years in prison before being released in 1904. She returned to America and lived until 1941, always maintaining her innocence and always insisting that James had died of natural illness, not poison. What makes Florence Maybrick's case significant, according to Nelman, is that it shows how Victorian anxieties about women's sexuality, women's knowledge of poisons and medicines, and women's potential for violence all came together in poison trials. Florence was an adulteress, which in Victorian morality made her a fallen woman capable of any sin. She was American, foreign, and suspect in English courts. She had access to arsenic, which many Victorian women did because arsenic was in flypaper and cosmetics and medicines, and her husband died with symptoms that could be interpreted as poisoning. According to Nelman, these factors combined to make Florence seem guilty regardless of the actual evidence, and modern analysis suggests she was probably innocent, convicted more for her sexual transgression than for actual murder. Let me tell you about a case from Spain. The story of Marcha de las Mercedes de Bourgogne Orleans, Countess of Barcelona, whose mother-in-law Princess Beatrice of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was rumoured to have been poisoned in 1966. According to research by Professor Paul Preston from the London School of Economics, whose work on Spanish royal history examines the Franco era, Beatrice died suddenly in July 1966 at age 66, while staying at a hotel in Estoril, Portugal. According to Preston, rumours immediately circulated that Beatrice had been poisoned, with suspicion falling on various members of the exiled Spanish royal family who had complicated relationships with her over questions of succession and politics. According to Preston, Beatrice was the wife of Infante Alfonso de Orleans, Urbana, a Spanish prince, and was closely involved in Spanish royal politics during the Franco era. She had strong opinions about who should succeed Franco as King of Spain, and her views conflicted with those of other royal family members. When she died, suddenly with symptoms that included vomiting and collapse, poison was immediately suspected by those who knew about the family conflicts. But according to Preston, autopsy results were inconclusive. The official cause of death was listed as heart attack, and no investigation into poisoning was ever conducted. The poison rumours remained just rumours, spread by those who found it convenient to suspect murder but never proven or disproven. What makes Beatrice's case relevant, according to Preston, is that it shows how poison accusations continued into the 20th century, how royal families continued to be shadowed by suspicions of poisoning whenever anyone died suddenly, and how the lack of transparency in royal deaths allowed rumours to flourish. According to Preston, Beatrice probably died of natural causes, but the rumours have persisted for over 50 years because royal families operate in secrecy and because poison accusations have such a long history in royal contexts that people are always ready to believe them. Now let me tell you about the affair of the poisons in more detail, because this massive investigation in late 17th century France reveals how poison panics could spiral out of control and destroy hundreds of lives. I mentioned earlier that the Marquise de Brinvilliers case triggered this affair, but the full story is even more dramatic and disturbing. According to research by Professor Anne Somerset, whose book The Affair of the Poisons provides comprehensive analysis, the investigation began in 1677, when police discovered a network of fortune tellers, alchemists and poison sellers operating in Paris, and it ultimately implicated some of the most powerful people at the court of Louis XIV, including his mistress Madame de Montespan. According to Somerset, the investigation was led by Nicolas de la Reynie, the Lieutenant General of Police in Paris, and was conducted by a special court called the Chambre Ardente, the burning chamber, so named because it met in a room draped in black and lit by torches. Over 5 years, the Chambre Ardente investigated over 400 people, conducted torture interrogations, and executed 36 people. The testimonies extracted from accused poisoners and fortune tellers revealed, or claimed to reveal, an extensive criminal underworld serving aristocratic clients who wanted poisons to eliminate rivals, love potions to win affection, and magical services to gain wealth and power. The most shocking accusations in the affair of the poisons, according to Somerset, involved Madame de Montespan, who had been Louis XIV's official mistress for over a decade and had borne him 7 children. According to testimony extracted under torture from a fortune teller named Catherine de Chaise, known as La Voisin, Montespan had purchased love potions and aphrodisiacs to maintain the king's affection, had participated in black masses involving the sacrifice of infants, and had allegedly planned to poison the king when she feared losing his favour. According to Somerset, La Voisin claimed that Montespan had come to her repeatedly between 1667 and 1680, seeking magical help to keep Louis's love and to eliminate rivals, including the king's wife and other mistresses. But according to Somerset, the accusations against Montespan were almost certainly false, extracted through torture from women who were told to implicate powerful people, and who knew that the more shocking their confessions, the more interest they generated. Lavazin was tortured and executed in 1680, and according to Somerset, her testimony about Montespan was full of inconsistencies and impossibilities. Louis XIV himself apparently didn't believe the accusations against Montespan, because although he ended their romantic relationship around 1680, he continued to support her financially and socially, and he never allowed her to be formally charged or investigated. The affair of the poisons finally ended in 1682, according to Somerset, when Louis XIV ordered the Chambre Ardente closed, and all remaining prisoners either executed or imprisoned for life without trial. According to Somerset, the king realised that the investigation had become a runaway witch hunt that was threatening the reputation of his entire court, that torture was producing false confessions, implicating innocent people, and that the scandal needed to be shut down before it destroyed the monarchy's credibility. The records of the investigation were sealed and weren't fully open to historians until the 19th century. What makes the affair of the poisons so important for understanding poison accusations, according to Somerset, is that it demonstrates how easily suspicion of poisoning could escalate into mass hysteria, how torture produced false confessions that implicated innocent people in imaginary crimes, and how poison accusations could be weaponized against the powerful, especially powerful women. According to Somerset, some of the people investigated and executed during the affair of the poisons were probably guilty of selling poisons and practicing illegal magic, but many others were almost certainly innocent, caught up in a moral panic that saw poison everywhere, and that needed ever more sensational accusations to sustain itself. Let me tell you about a case from Russia, Grand Duchess Alexandra Pavlovna, who died in 1801 under circumstances that led to poison rumours. Alexandra was born on the 9th of August, 1783, the eldest daughter of Tsar Paul I of Russia. According to research by Professor Janet Hartley from the London School of Economics, whose work on Russian imperial history examines the Romanov family, Alexandra was married in 1799 at age 15 to Archduke Joseph of Austria, Palatine of Hungary, in a political alliance designed to strengthen Russian-Austrian relations. The marriage was reportedly happy, but Alexandra's health had never been strong, and pregnancy put enormous strain on her body. In March 1801, according to Hartley, Alexandra gave birth to a daughter who died within hours. Alexandra herself died 6 days later, on the 16th of March 1801, at age 17. According to Hartley, the official cause of death was puerperal fever, also called childbed fever, a common and often fatal infection following childbirth in the era before antiseptics and antibiotics. But rumours immediately began in both Russia and Austria that Alexandra had been poisoned, with various theories about who might have wanted her dead and why. According to Hartley, the poison rumours about Alexandra had no basis in fact, but reflected several contexts. First, Alexandra's father, Tsar Paul I, was extremely unpopular in Russia and would himself be assassinated just 1 week after Alexandra's death in a palace coup on the 23rd of March 1801. In this atmosphere of conspiracy and violence, people were ready to see poison in any death connected to the imperial family. Second, Alexandra had died far from Russia in Hungary, and the distance allowed rumours to flourish, because information travelled slowly and unreliably. Third, childbed fever was poorly understood in 1801, and any death of a young woman after childbirth could be attributed to poison by those unfamiliar with the medical reality. What makes Alexandra's case significant, according to Hartley, is that it shows how royal deaths in childbirth, which were tragically common, could nonetheless trigger poison accusations, because people assumed that royalty shouldn't die like common women, that their deaths must have sinister causes. According to Hartley, Alexandra almost certainly died of puerperal fever, but the poison rumours persisted for years, another example of how royal women's deaths were viewed with suspicion, regardless of medical evidence. Now let me tell you about Madeline Smith, whose trial in 1857 Scotland became one of the most famous Victorian poison cases and raised questions about women's agency and culpability that are still relevant today. Madeleine was born in 1835 into a wealthy Glasgow family, according to research by Professor Eleanor Gordon from the University of Glasgow, whose work on women and crime examines the Smith case. Madeleine had a secret relationship with a man named Pierre Firmile Langelier, a poor clerk from Jersey who was considered socially beneath her. The relationship lasted from 1855 to 1857 and involved passionate letters from Madeleine to Firmile, letters that discuss their physical intimacy in terms that were shocking for a Victorian woman. In March 1857, according to Gordon, Firmile Langelier died of arsenic poisoning after meeting with Madeleine. Evidence showed that Madeleine had purchased arsenic multiple times in the weeks before Firmile's death, signing the poison register as required by law and claiming she needed arsenic to kill rats and to use as a cosmetic, which was a common Victorian practice. After Firmile's death, Madeleine was arrested and charged with his murder by arsenic poisoning, and her passionate letters to him were used as evidence of their relationship and her motive to kill him, either because she wanted to end the relationship and marry someone of her own class, or because Firmile was blackmailing her with the letters. Madeleine's trial in June 1857 was a sensation, according to Gordon, with enormous public interest in this respectable middle-class woman who had written sexually explicit letters and who stood accused of murdering her lover with poison. The prosecution argued that Madeleine had poisoned Firmile because she wanted to be free to marry someone else, and because she feared that Firmile would reveal their relationship and ruin her reputation. The defence argued that Firmile had actually committed suicide by arsenic, possibly to frame Madeleine, or possibly because he was despondent over their relationship ending, and that Madeleine had purchased arsenic for legitimate cosmetic purposes, not for murder. The jury returned a verdict of not proven, according to Gordon, a uniquely Scottish verdict that meant the jury wasn't convinced of guilt beyond reasonable doubt, but also wasn't prepared to declare the defendant innocent. Madeleine was freed, but lived under a cloud of suspicion for the rest of her life. She eventually emigrated to America, married twice, and lived until 1928. But she never spoke publicly about Firmile Langelier's death, and never definitively stated whether she had poisoned him or not. What makes Madeleine Smith's case fascinating, according to Gordon, is the ambiguity at its heart. Did Madeleine poison Firmile because he was threatening her with exposure and blackmail? Did Firmile commit suicide to punish Madeleine for rejecting him? Did Firmile die accidentally from arsenic he was taking as a tonic? According to Gordon, the evidence doesn't definitively support any of these theories, and we will never know for certain what happened. But what is clear, according to Gordon, is that Madeleine's case scandalised Victorian society, not primarily because of the possible murder, but because of the sexual transgression revealed in her letters. Because a young middle-class woman had had sexual relations before marriage, and had written explicitly about physical desire, violating every rule of Victorian femininity. Let me tell you about the connection between poison and domestic abuse, because understanding this context is crucial for evaluating historical poison cases. According to research by Professor Elizabeth Foister from the University of Oxford, whose work on marital violence examines historical patterns, many women who poisoned or attempted to poison their husbands in earlier centuries were living in situations of ongoing violence and abuse with no legal means of escape. In England, before the 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act, divorce was essentially impossible for all but the wealthiest aristocracy, requiring a private act of parliament and costing thousands of pounds. Women couldn't legally separate from abusive husbands, couldn't get protection orders, couldn't leave without abandoning their children, and had almost no legal rights within marriage. According to Foister, the legal doctrine of coverture meant that married women had no independent legal existence, All their property belonged to their husbands. They couldn't sign contracts or sue in court, and their husbands had the legal right to physically correct them with moderate violence. A woman trapped in a marriage with a violent husband had essentially three options: endure the abuse until one of them died, run away and live as a fugitive with no money and no way to support herself, or kill the husband. According to Foister, poison was the method that some desperate women chose because it was the only method that didn't require physical strength, and that could be accomplished by someone with no resources except access to the husband's food and drink. According to Foister's analysis of historical court records, many women prosecuted for poisoning their husbands had documented histories of abuse, had visible scars from beatings, had tried to seek help from neighbours or clergy, and been told to submit to their husbands, and had finally resorted to poison as the only way out. But according to Foister, courts rarely accepted abuse as a defence or even as mitigation for poisoning. The law saw wifehood as a sacred duty, and killing a husband was not just murder but petty treason, a crime against the social order itself. Women convicted of husband murder in England could be burned at the stake until 1790, a punishment designed to emphasise the particular horror of a wife killing the man who was legally her master. What this means for understanding historical poison cases, according to Foister, is that we need to ask questions about the context of accusations and convictions. Was the woman accused of poisoning her husband living in an abusive marriage? Had she tried to seek help through legal means and been denied? Was poison her last desperate option after all other avenues were closed? According to Foister, many women executed for poisoning their husbands throughout history were arguably acting in self-defense against ongoing violence. But the law didn't recognize this defense because it saw wives as their husbands' property and subordinates, not as independent persons with rights to safety and autonomy. Now let me tell you about a specific case that illustrates this dynamic. Mary Blandy, executed in England in 1752 for poisoning her father in a case that involved domestic control and parental abuse. Mary was born in 720 in Henley-on-Thames, the only child of a prosperous attorney. According to research by Professor Anthony E. Simpson from Brock University, whose work on 18th century crime examines the Blandy case, Mary was intelligent and educated, but her father, Francis Blandy, controlled every aspect of her life, refusing to allow her to marry any of her suitors because he deemed them financially inadequate or socially beneath the family. In 1746, according to Simpson, Mary met Captain William Henry Cranstoun, a Scottish military officer, and fell in love with him. But Cranstoun had problems. He was already married, though he claimed the marriage was invalid and was seeking an annulment, and he was poor and in debt. Francis Blandy opposed the relationship and tried to prevent Mary from seeing Cranstoun. But Mary at age 26 was determined to have some autonomy over her own life. According to Simpson, Cranstoun sent Mary powders that he claimed were magical love potions that would make her father approve of their relationship, and Mary administered these powders to her father by putting them in his tea and food. In August 1751, Francis Blandy became seriously ill with symptoms that included vomiting, stomach pain, and weakness. He died on the 14th of August, 1751, and Mary was immediately suspected of poisoning him. According to Simpson, servants had seen Mary putting white powder into her father's food and had noticed that the gruel Mary gave her father had a gritty texture. Investigation revealed that the powder was arsenic, and Mary was arrested and charged with murdering her father by arsenic poisoning. Mary's trial in March 1752 was a sensation, according to Simpson, with intense public interest in this genteel woman accused of patricide. Mary's defence was that she didn't know the powders Cranstoun sent her were arsenic, that she believed they were harmless love potions, and that she had no intention of killing her father. She claimed that Cranstoun had deceived her, telling her the powders would soften her father's heart, not poison his body. The prosecution argued that Mary must have known the powders were poison because she was educated and intelligent, that she had motive to kill her father, because he opposed her relationship with Cranstoun, and that her actions in administering the powder constituted murder, even if Cranstoun was the ultimate architect of the crime. The jury convicted Mary after deliberating for only 5 minutes, according to Simpson, and she was sentenced to death. She was hanged at Oxford on the 6th of April, 1752, at age 31. Cranstoun fled England and died in France later that year, never prosecuted for his role in the poisoning. Mary maintained until her death that she believed the powders were love potions, not poison, that she loved her father and never intended to harm him, and that she was a victim of Cranstoun's deception and manipulation. What makes Mary Blandy's case significant, according to Simpson, is that it raises questions about culpability and coercion. Was Mary a cold-blooded murderer who poisoned her father to be free to marry Cranstoun? Or was she a naive victim manipulated by Cranstoun into administering poison she didn't recognize? According to Simpson, the evidence doesn't clearly support either interpretation. But what is clear is that Mary was a woman whose father controlled her life so completely that at age 31 she had never been allowed to marry, whose desperation for love and autonomy made her vulnerable to Cranstoun's manipulation, and whose actions, whether intentional murder or tragic mistake, cost her life. Let me tell you about the case of Christiana Edmonds, who poisoned people in Brighton, England in 1871, not to escape marriage, but in an obsessive attempt to win a married man's love. Christiana was born in 1828 into a respectable middle-class family. According to research by Professor Judith Flanders, whose work on Victorian crime examines the Edmonds case, Christiana lived with her domineering mother and had never married, becoming increasingly isolated and mentally unstable as she aged. In 1870, she developed an obsessive fixation on her doctor, Charles Beard, a married man who had treated her for various ailments. According to Flanders, Christiana apparently believed that if she could eliminate Beard's wife, he would be free to marry her. In September 1870, Christiana sent Mrs. Beard chocolates laced with strychnine. Mrs. Beard ate one chocolate and became violently ill but survived. Dr. Beard immediately suspected Christiana and ended all contact with her, which should have ended the affair. But Christiana's obsession only intensified. Over the following months, according to Flanders, Christiana purchased strychnine multiple times and began a campaign of random poisonings in Brighton. She bought chocolates from local shops, injected them with strychnine, and then returned them to the shops claiming they tasted odd, so that the shops would resell the poisoned chocolates to other customers. According to Flanders, Christiana's apparent plan was to create a poisoning scare that would make it appear that Mrs. Beard's illness had been random bad luck rather than a targeted attack, thus deflecting suspicion from Christiana herself. Several people became ill from eating the poisoned chocolates, and in June 1871, a 4-year-old boy named Sidney Barker died after eating strychnine, laced chocolates purchased from a Brighton confectioner. The death of Sidney Barker triggered a massive investigation, according to Flanders, and police eventually traced the poisoned chocolates to Christiana Edmonds. She was arrested in August 1871 and charged with murder. At her trial in January 1872, Christiana's defense argued that she was insane, suffering from what Victorian medicine called erotomania, an obsessive delusional love. The prosecution argued that Christiana was sane and had deliberately poisoned people to cover up her attempt to poison Mrs. Beard. The jury convicted her of murder, and she was sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted to life in an insane asylum because even the judge doubted her sanity. Christiana spent the rest of her life in Broadmoor Asylum, dying there in 1907 at age 79. What makes Christiana Edmonds' case significant, according to Flanders, is that it illustrates how poison was associated, not just with women seeking to escape marriages, but with women experiencing what Victorians saw as perverted or excessive desire. Women who couldn't or didn't control their sexual and romantic feelings, as Victorian femininity required. Christiana wasn't married and wasn't trying to escape a husband, but she was prosecuted as a poisoner nonetheless, and her case reinforced Victorian fears about women's desires, women's access to poisons, and women's potential for irrational violence when in the grip of uncontrolled passion. Now, let me tell you about a case from the Ottoman Empire. The allegations against Temzem Sultan, one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, who was accused by enemies of using poison to maintain her political control. Temzem was born in 1589, probably in Greece, and was brought to the Ottoman harem as a slave. According to research by Professor Leslie Pierce from the University of California, Berkeley, whose work on Ottoman women examines Khayyam's life, she became the favourite wife of Sultan Ahmad I, and after his death in 1617 became one of the most influential women in Ottoman history, serving as regent for her sons Murad, Aviv and Ibrahim, and wielding enormous political power for over 40 years. During her decades of power, according to Pierce, Khayyam made many enemies among rival factions at court, and those enemies accused her of using poison to eliminate rivals and to control succession. According to rumours recorded by contemporary observers and analysed by Pierce, Cordova was accused of poisoning Sultan Osman II in 1622, though he was actually strangled to death during a palace coup that courted Tazim may have supported. She was accused of poisoning her own son Sultan Ibrahim I in 1648, though again he was actually killed by strangulation during a coup. She was accused of poisoning various rivals, advisors and courtiers who opposed her policies or threatened her position. According to Pierce, none of these poison accusations were supported by evidence. They were political propaganda spread by Khayyam's enemies to delegitimize her power and to portray her as a female usurper using criminal methods rather than legitimate authority. The accusations combined several damaging themes. Khayyam was originally a slave, so she was using slave treachery rather than noble governance. She was a woman wielding power in a system that preferred male authority, so she must be using feminine weapons like poison, and she was powerful for decades, which suggested she must be eliminating rivals through secret means rather than through legitimate political skill. In 1651, according to Pierce, Khayyam herself was strangled to death during a palace coup led by her daughter-in-law Turhan Hatis, ending her 40-year domination of Ottoman politics. After her death, the poison rumours about her intensified, with historians and chroniclers adding ever more lurid details about her supposed crimes. According to Pierce, Khayyam probably never poisoned anyone. She was a skilled politician who maintained power through intelligence, strategic marriages, control of finances, and careful alliance building. But admitting that a former slave woman could wield power through ability was apparently impossible for Ottoman male chroniclers. So they invented poison stories to explain and delegitimize her success. Let me tell you about the scientific understanding of how poisons actually work, because this knowledge helps us evaluate whether historical accusations were plausible. According to research by Professor John Henry from the University of Edinburgh, whose work on the history of toxicology examines poison knowledge, people in earlier centuries had surprisingly sophisticated empirical knowledge about poisons even though they didn't understand the chemical or biological mechanisms. Poisoners knew which plants were toxic, which doses were fatal versus merely sickening, and how to disguise poisons in food and drink, but they didn't understand why poisons worked the way they did. According to Henry, arsenic was the most popular poison for centuries because it had characteristics that made it ideal for secret murder. It was tasteless and odorless, so victims didn't notice it in food or drink. It was readily available in rat poisons and other products. Small doses caused symptoms that mimicked common diseases like cholera or dysentery, making poisoning hard to detect, and it could be administered in small doses over time, creating chronic illness that appeared natural. Arsenic works by interfering with cellular respiration and energy production, essentially starving cells at the molecular level. But historical poisoners didn't need to understand this mechanism to know that arsenic killed reliably. Other common historical poisons, according to Henry, included belladonna and other nightshade plants containing alkaloids that affected the nervous system, causing symptoms like dilated pupils, confusion, rapid heartbeat, and in high doses death from respiratory paralysis. Mercury compounds that cause tremors, mental confusion, and organ damage, and various plant poisons like hemlock, wolfsbane, and foxglove that affected the heart and nervous system. According to Henry, historical knowledge of these poisons was often remarkably accurate in terms of doses and effects, passed down through generations of herbalists, healers, and yes, poisoners, even though scientific understanding of the mechanisms didn't exist until the 19th and 20th centuries. What this means for evaluating historical poison accusations, according to Henry, is that poisoning was definitely possible and definitely happened. Poisoners did have access to effective poisons and did know how to use them, so we shouldn't dismiss all poison accusations as mere paranoia. But the flip side, according to Henry, is that because poison knowledge was relatively common, especially knowledge of plant-based poisons among women who practiced herbal healing, accusation of poisoning was easy and often based more on suspicion and opportunity than on proof. Any woman who knew about herbs, who had prepared medicines, who had access to a sick person's food, could be accused of poisoning if that person died, regardless of actual guilt. Now, let me tell you about how poison accusations reflected class anxieties and class prejudices, because the way poison cases were prosecuted and perceived depended enormously on the social status of the accused. According to research by Professor Martin Weiner from Rice University, whose work on crime and class in Victorian England examines poison trials, middle-class and upper-class women accused of poisoning received extensive press coverage, public sympathy, and often benefit of the doubt from juries, while working-class women accused of the same crime were swiftly convicted and executed with minimal public concern. According to Weiner, the case of Florence Maybrick that I mentioned earlier illustrates this dynamic. Florence was a respectable middle-class woman, American but well-connected, married to a wealthy merchant. Her trial was a sensation. Her case generated petitions for clemency signed by thousands of people, and her death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, partly because of public outcry that such a refined woman couldn't possibly be a brutal poisoner. But contrast this, according to Weiner, with the case of Sarah Chesham, a working-class agricultural labourer's wife who was executed in 1851 for poisoning her husband with arsenic. Sarah's trial attracted minimal attention. She had no powerful defenders, and she was hanged within weeks of her conviction, with almost no public concern for whether she might be innocent or might have been driven to poison by desperation. According to Weiner, this class disparity reflected Victorian beliefs about refinement and brutality. Middle-class women were supposed to be naturally refined, delicate, moral, incapable of the brutality of murder. When middle-class women were accused of poisoning, Victorian society struggled to reconcile the accusation with class prejudices, often concluding that the woman must be innocent or insane or manipulated by a man, because a truly refined woman couldn't commit such a crime. But working-class women were seen as naturally coarse, passionate, prone to violence, lacking the moral restraints that education and refinement provided. When working-class women were accused of poisoning, according to Weiner, Victorian society readily believed the accusations because they fit class prejudices about working-class brutality and immorality. This meant, according to Weiner, that working-class women were convicted of poisoning on much weaker evidence than would be required to convict middle-class women, were executed more readily, and had their cases forgotten by history, while middle-class poison cases became famous scandals that people debated for years. According to Weiner, this class bias in poison prosecutions meant that many working-class women were probably wrongly convicted and executed, while some middle-class women probably got away with murder because juries couldn't believe that refined ladies would commit such crimes. Let me tell you about a case from India during the British Raj, the trial of Ratanbai Kazi in Bombay in 1900, accused of poisoning her husband, a case that combined gender prejudice, colonial prejudice, and class prejudice. According to research by Professor Janaki Nair from Jawaharlal Nehru University, whose work on women and crime in colonial India examines poison cases, Rutanbai was a young Parsi woman married to a wealthy merchant. In 1900, her husband died suddenly after a brief illness, and Rutanbai was accused of poisoning him with arsenic to be free to marry her lover. According to Nair, Rutanbai's trial was covered extensively in both English and vernacular press in India, and the coverage revealed complex attitudes about gender, race, and poison. British colonial authorities and British residents in India viewed the case as confirming their prejudices about Indian women being treacherous and about Indian society being morally backward. Indian reformers viewed the case as shameful evidence that Indian women needed more education and moral guidance, and Parsi community leaders were divided, some defending Rutanbai and some condemning her to distance the community from scandal. The evidence against Rutanbai was circumstantial. According to Nair, she had purchased arsenic, claiming it was for rat poison. She had been seen in the company of a man other than her husband, and her husband had died with symptoms that could be interpreted as poisoning. But there was no proof that she had administered poison, no witnesses to actual poisoning, and the medical evidence was questionable. Nonetheless, according to Nair, Rutanbai was convicted and sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. She spent 15 years in prison before being released in 1915. What makes Rutanbai's case significant, according to Nair, is that it shows how poison accusations in colonial contexts carried additional layers of prejudice beyond gender. Rutanbai was judged not just as a woman, but as an Indian woman, subject to colonial stereotypes about Indian treachery and backwardness. Her case was used by British authorities as propaganda about the need for colonial rule to civilize India, and it was used by Indian reformers as evidence that Indian women needed to be reformed and modernized. According to Nair, Rutanbai's actual guilt or innocence became almost irrelevant to the larger political and social uses to which her case was put. Now let me tell you about the modern understanding of some historical poison deaths, and how forensic science has in some cases exonerated historical figures, and in other cases confirmed guilt posthumously. According to research by Professor Andrew Cunningham from the University of Cambridge, whose work on historical disease examines retrospective diagnosis, modern scientists have used various techniques, including analysis of preserved hair samples, exhumation and testing of remains, and examination of historical medical records to determine whether historical figures died of poisoning or natural causes. One famous case, according to Cunningham, is Napoleon Bonaparte, who died in 1821 on St. Helena, and whose death has been the subject of poison rumours for 2 centuries. In the 1960s, scientists analysed samples of Napoleon's hair and found elevated levels of arsenic, leading to theories that Napoleon was slowly poisoned by his British captors or by French royalists. But more recent analysis, according to Cunningham, suggests that the arsenic in Napoleon's hair probably came from environmental exposure, from arsenic in the wallpaper in his residence, which could release arsenic vapour in damp conditions, or from arsenic-based medicines that Napoleon took for various ailments. According to Cunningham, modern medical consensus is that Napoleon probably died of stomach cancer, not poisoning, despite the poison rumours that have persisted for 200 years. Another case where modern science has provided answers, according to Cunningham, is the death of King George III's son Prince Octavius in 1783 at age 4. At the time, some people suspected that the child had been poisoned, possibly by political enemies of his father. But modern analysis of historical medical records, according to Cunningham, shows that Octavius died of smallpox, and the symptoms recorded at the time are entirely consistent with smallpox and not at all consistent with poisoning. The poison rumours, according to Cunningham, were based on grief-fueled conspiracy thinking and political paranoia, not on medical evidence. But modern science has also confirmed some historical poisonings, according to Cunningham. Analysis of the exhumed remains of Tycho Brahe, The Danish astronomer who died in 1601, long suspected of being poisoned, found lethal levels of mercury in his body, confirming that he did indeed die of mercury poisoning, though whether the poisoning was accidental or deliberate remains disputed. According to Cunningham, modern forensic techniques have solved some historical mysteries while showing that many poison accusations were baseless, and they've demonstrated just how difficult it is to determine cause of death, even with modern science when the death occurred centuries ago. Let me tell you about the literature and popular culture of poison, because understanding how poison was represented in fiction helps us understand the cultural fears and fascinations that made poison accusations so powerful. According to research by Professor Alison Sinclair from the University of Cambridge, whose work on poison in literature examines cultural representations, poison has been a staple of literature from ancient Greek drama through modern detective fiction, and the ways poison is portrayed reveal society's anxieties about hidden threats, about trust and betrayal, and especially about women's power to harm. According to Sinclair, ancient Greek and Roman literature was full of poison stories, often featuring women poisoners like Medea, who killed her rival with a poisoned dress, or the Roman empresses whose poisoning schemes filled the pages of Tacitus and Suetonius. Medieval literature featured poison as the weapon of choice for villains and traitors, people who couldn't or wouldn't fight honestly with swords. Renaissance literature, including Shakespeare's plays, featured numerous poisonings. Hamlet's father poisoned by his brother, Romeo and Juliet dying by poison, and various villains in other plays using poison to eliminate enemies. Victorian literature, according to Sinclair, was absolutely obsessed with poison, with sensation novels and detective stories featuring poisoning plots, often with female poisoners. Novels like Lady Audley's Secret featured beautiful women accused of terrible crimes, including poisoning. The rise of detective fiction by writers like Wilkie Collins and later Agatha Christie made poison a central element, with clever detectives using emerging forensic science to catch poisoners who thought they could commit the perfect crime. According to Sinclair, this literary obsession with poison both reflected and reinforced Victorian anxieties about poison in real life, creating a feedback loop where real poison scares inspired fictional poison plots, which in turn made people more afraid of real poisoning. What makes this literary tradition significant, according to Sinclair, is that it shaped how real poison cases were perceived. When real women were accused of poisoning, people interpreted their cases through the lens of fictional poison plots they had read. Life imitated art, with prosecutors and journalists describing real accused poisoners in language borrowed from sensation novels, emphasizing their supposedly cunning nature, their deceptive femininity, their cold-blooded planning. According to Sinclair, this meant that women accused of poisoning in the Victorian era were fighting not just against specific evidence, but against centuries of cultural representations that cast female poisoners as the ultimate villains. Now let me tell you about Charlotte Bryant, executed in England in 1936 for poisoning her husband, one of the last women executed for husband murder in Britain, and a case that shows how poison prosecutions continued into the modern era, even as they became rarer. Charlotte was born in 1903 in Ireland and married Frederick Bryant, an English farm labourer, in 1922. According to research by Professor Annette Bollinger from Keele University, whose work on executed women examines the Bryant case, Charlotte and Frederick had a volatile marriage marked by poverty, numerous children, and mutual infidelity. In 1933, according to Bollinger, Charlotte began an affair with a lodger named Leonard Parsons, and the affair continued for several years with Frederick apparently aware and tolerant. But in December 1935, Frederick became ill with symptoms including vomiting, abdominal pain, and weakness. He died on the 22nd of December 1935, and an autopsy revealed arsenic in his body. Charlotte was arrested and charged with murdering her husband, by arsenic poisoning. Charlotte's trial in May 1936 was one of the first British murder trials to use modern forensic toxicology extensively, according to Bollinger. Expert witnesses testified about the levels of arsenic found in Frederick's body, about how arsenic was absorbed and distributed in the body, about how to distinguish between acute poisoning and chronic exposure. The prosecution argued that Charlotte had poisoned Frederick to be free to marry Leonard Parsons, that she had administered arsenic over several weeks or months, causing chronic poisoning, and that the arsenic found in Frederick's body proved murder. Charlotte's defense was weak, according to Bollinger. She denied poisoning her husband, suggested that he might have accidentally ingested arsenic from weed killer or other sources around the farm, and claimed that her affair with Parsons was irrelevant to the question of whether she had committed murder. But the jury convicted her after just 2 hours of deliberation, and she was sentenced to death. Despite appeals and petitions for clemency, Charlotte was hanged on the 15th of July, 1936. At age 33, one of the last women executed in Britain for murdering her husband. What makes Charlotte Bryant's case significant, according to Bollinger, is that even in 1936, with modern forensic science available, with changing attitudes about women's sexuality and women's rights, with divorce more available than in previous centuries, a poor working-class woman accused of poisoning her husband was still swiftly convicted and executed. According to Bollinger, the evidence against Charlotte was strong. Arsenic was definitely found in Frederick's body in lethal quantities, but questions remain about whether Charlotte actually administered it, or whether Frederick might have been poisoning himself accidentally or deliberately. What is clear, according to Bollinger, is that Charlotte's poverty, her working-class status, her sexual transgression in having an affair, all made her seem guilty and made her execution acceptable to authorities and public alike. Now, let me tell you about the fascinating and disturbing history of poison antidotes and preventive measures, because understanding how people tried to protect themselves from poison reveals just how pervasive the fear of poisoning was in historical societies. According to research by Professor Tessa Story from Royal Holloway University of London, whose work on Renaissance poison culture examines protective practices, wealthy and powerful people in medieval and Renaissance Europe employed elaborate rituals and substances to protect themselves from poisoning. Rituals that reflected both genuine knowledge and superstitious belief. According to Story, one of the most common protective practices was the use of poison tasters, servants whose job was to taste the food and drink before it was served to nobles and royalty, suffering any poisoning so that their masters would be safe. Poison tasters were used by Roman emperors, by medieval kings, by Renaissance popes, and the practice continued in some courts into the 18th century. According to Story, being a poison taster was a position of both trust and vulnerability. Servants chosen for this role had to be absolutely loyal because they had constant access to their master's food, but they lived under constant threat of painful death if someone did attempt poisoning. Another protective measure, according to Story, was the use of various objects believed to detect or neutralize poison. Pieces of unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, were believed to change color or sweat in the presence of poison, and wealthy people paid enormous sums for unicorn horn cups, or for pieces of horn to dip into their food and drink. Bezoar stones, calcified masses from the stomachs of ruminant animals, were believed to be universal antidotes to poison, able to neutralize any toxin. Powdered gemstones, particularly emeralds and sapphires, were believed to protect against poison, and various herbs like rue, garlic, and fenugreek were believed to provide protection when eaten regularly. According to Story, some of these protective measures had actual medical value. Mithridatium and theriac, complex mixtures of dozens of ingredients including opium, viper flesh, and various herbs, were believed to be universal antidotes and were prescribed as preventive medicine for centuries. Modern analysis, according to Story, suggests that these mixtures might have provided some protection against certain poisons, particularly plant-based alkaloids, though they were useless against arsenic and other mineral poisons. but many other protective measures were pure superstition. Unicorn horn had no magical properties, bezoar stones didn't neutralize poisons, and powdered emeralds were more likely to cause harm than prevent it. What makes these protective practices significant, according to story, is that they reveal the depth of fear about poisoning in historical societies. Wealthy and powerful people spent enormous sums on protective measures, employed poison tasters at great expense, and lived under constant anxiety about being poisoned. According to story, this pervasive fear both reflected genuine risk. Poisoning did happen and was difficult to detect, and created a paranoid atmosphere where any illness could be interpreted as poisoning, where anyone who had access to food could be suspected as a poisoner, and where poison accusations flourished because people were primed to believe them. Let me tell you about a lesser-known but fascinating case from medieval Italy, the story of La Spara, the nickname given to Girolamo Spara, who ran what may have been the first documented poison, selling rings specifically targeting unhappy wives in Rome in the 1650s. According to research by Professor Elizabeth S. Cohen from York University, whose work on women and crime in early modern Rome examines poison cases, Girolamo Spara sold a clear, tasteless poison, probably arsenic-based, marketed specifically to women who wanted to poison their husbands, advertising it as acqua della Tofana, connecting it to the later and more famous Giulia Tofana's poison business. According to Cohen, Spara operated her business for several years in the 1650s, selling poison disguised as a religious devotion, packets supposedly containing holy water or blessed powders that women could plausibly keep in their homes without suspicion. Spara apparently instructed her clients on how to administer the poison gradually in food or drink, creating symptoms that would appear to be natural illness. According to contemporary accounts analysed by Cohen, Spara claimed to have helped 12 women poison their husbands before her business was discovered in 1659, when one of her clients confessed to her priest. The confession triggered an investigation, according to Cohen, and Spara was arrested along with several accomplices and several of her clients. Under torture, according to Cohen, Spara confessed to selling poison to numerous women and to instructing them in how to murder their husbands. She was executed by hanging in Rome, and several of her clients were also executed. According to Cohen, the Spara case caused a sensation in Rome and throughout Italy, triggering a moral panic about wife poisoners and leading to increased scrutiny of any sudden deaths of husbands. What makes the Spara case significant, according to Cohen, is that it raises questions about agency and victimhood. Were the women who bought Spara's poison cold-blooded murderers seeking to escape marriages for convenience? Or were they desperate victims of domestic violence, seeking the only means of escape available to them? According to Cohen, the historical record doesn't allow us to answer this definitively, but what is clear is that Spara's business existed because there was demand, because enough women felt desperate enough about their marriages to risk execution to end them, and because the Catholic Church's prohibition on divorce meant women had no legal means of escape from even the most abusive marriages. Now let me tell you about poison in Chinese imperial history, because the story of poison accusations in China parallels many patterns from European history, while also having distinctive cultural elements. According to research by Professor Jennifer Holmgren from the University of New England, Australia, whose work on Chinese empresses examines palace politics, poison accusations against powerful women were common throughout Chinese imperial history, directed especially at empress dowagers, concubines who gained power, and women accused of manipulating succession. According to Holmgren, one of the most famous poison accusations in Chinese history involved Empress Lefjie of the Han Dynasty, who ruled as Empress Dowager from 1995 to 180 BCE. Empress Li was one of the most powerful women in Chinese history, ruling as regent for her son and then grandson, and effectively controlling the Han Empire for 15 years. According to historical chronicles analysed by Holmgren, Empress Eli was accused by her enemies, and by later historians, of poisoning Emperor Gaozu's favourite concubine, consort Qi, and of poisoning or arranging the murders of various other rivals and obstacles to her power. The most famous accusation, according to Holmgren, was that Empress Li poisoned consort Qi's son, Prince Ruyi of Zhao, in 94 BCE when he was just 14 years old. According to the historical accounts, Ruyi had been designated as potential heir by Emperor Gaozu before his death, threatening the position of Empress Xiao's son as emperor. When Ruyi died suddenly after visiting the capital, poison was immediately suspected and Empress Li was blamed. According to Holmgren, whether Empress Li actually poisoned Ruyi is impossible to determine from the historical sources, which were written by historians hostile to powerful women and prone to attributing any convenient death to the Empress's schemes. What makes Empress Li's story significant in the Chinese context, according to Holmgren, is that it established a pattern that would recur throughout Chinese imperial history. A powerful Empress Dowager was accused of using poison to eliminate rivals and control succession, and these accusations, whether true or false, were used to justify Confucian prejudices against women wielding political power. According to Confucian ideology, analysed by Holmgren, women should not rule. Women who did rule were inherently illegitimate, and poison accusations were one way to delegitimize female rulers, by suggesting they achieved and maintained power through criminal means, rather than through the mandate of heaven that supposedly legitimized male emperors. Another famous Chinese poison case, according to Holmgren, involved Empress Dowager Cixi of the Qing dynasty, who effectively ruled China from 1861 to 1908. One of the longest reigning female rulers in world history. Throughout her nearly 50-year domination of Chinese politics, Cixi was repeatedly accused by enemies and critics of using poison to eliminate rivals and obstacles. According to rumours analysed by Holmgren, Cixi was accused of poisoning the Xianfeng Emperor in 1861, though he died of natural causes, of poisoning the Tongzhou Emperor in 1875. Though he died of smallpox, of poisoning the Guangxu Emperor in 1908, though modern testing suggests he died of arsenic poisoning, possibly self-administered, and of poisoning various court officials and rivals over her decades in power. According to Holmgren, none of these accusations against Cixi can be definitively proven. They were political propaganda spread by reformers who opposed her conservative policies, by Confucian traditionalists who believed women shouldn't rule, and by foreign observers who viewed China through Orientalist stereotypes about Asian treachery and cruelty. Modern historians, according to Holmgren, generally view Cixi as a skilled politician who maintained power through intelligence and political maneuvering, not through poison, but the poison accusations have persisted in popular imagination. Another example of how accusations of poisoning stick to powerful women regardless of evidence. Let me tell you about how the advent of the modern chemical industry both reduced poisoning as a method of murder and created new poison panics. According to research by Professor James Horton from the University of Washington, whose book The Arsenic Century examines Victorian poison culture, the 19th century saw an explosion in the availability of poisons due to industrialization, while simultaneously seeing the development of regulations and detection methods that made poisoning more risky. According to Wharton, arsenic became ubiquitous in Victorian Britain due to its use in manufacturing. Arsenic was used to create green dyes for wallpaper, fabrics, and artificial flowers, leading to chronic arsenic exposure for workers and consumers. Arsenic was used in rat poisons and weed killers sold in every town. Arsenic was used in medicines, cosmetics, and tonics. According to Wharton, by the 1840s, arsenic was so readily available that anyone could purchase it easily, and this availability coincided with a spike in arsenic poisoning cases, or at least in poison accusations and poison panics. The response, according to Wharton, was the passage of the Arsenic Act in Britain in 1851, which required that arsenic sales be recorded in a poison register with the buyer's name, address, and stated purpose for the purchase, and that arsenic be coloured with soot or indigo dye so it couldn't be mistaken for flour or other white powders. Similar regulations were passed in other countries. According to Wharton, these regulations made it harder to purchase arsenic anonymously and made it easier to trace poisoning cases back to purchasers. And combined with the development of the Marsh test for detecting arsenic, they led to a decrease in arsenic poisoning by the late 19th century. But according to Wharton, the regulations and detection methods didn't end the poison panic. They transformed it. Victorian newspapers and popular literature were filled with poison stories. Sensation trials like those of Florence Maybrick and Madeline Smith sold enormous numbers of newspapers, and the public was simultaneously fascinated and terrified by poisoning cases. According to Wharton, this Victorian poison panic was out of proportion to the actual risk. Statistically, poisoning was rare compared to other causes of death, but it dominated public imagination because of the fear of hidden domestic threats, the association with women and feminine treachery, and the way poison cases allowed people to discuss sexuality, marital conflict, and women's agency in ways that were otherwise taboo. Now let me tell you about Ruth Snyder, executed in the United States in 1928 for murdering her husband, a case that became one of the most sensational criminal trials of the 1920s, and shows how poison cases were perceived in modern America. Ruth was born in 1895 in New York and married Albert Snyder, a magazine editor, in 1915, according to research by Professor Douglas O. Linda from the University of Missouri Kansas City School of Law, whose work on famous trials examines the Snyder case. Ruth's marriage was unhappy from the start, with Albert being emotionally cold and often cruel, constantly comparing Ruth unfavourably to his deceased first fiancée. In 1925, according to Linda, Ruth began an affair with a corset salesman named Judd Gray, and over the next 2 years Ruth and Judd plotted to kill Albert. According to Linda, Ruth made several attempts to kill Albert using poison, hiding sleeping powder in his whiskey, and then trying to gas him while he was unconscious, but all these attempts failed. Finally, in March 1927, Ruth and Judd bludgeoned Albert to death with a sash weight, strangled him with picture wire, and staged the scene to look like a burglary gone wrong. The murder was quickly discovered to be staged, according to Linda, and both Ruth and Judd were arrested within days. At trial, Judd claimed that Ruth had manipulated and seduced him into helping murder her husband, that he was weak and she was the criminal mastermind. Ruth claimed that Judd had planned the murder and she had merely gone along. The jury didn't believe either of them, convicting both of first-degree murder. Ruth was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison on the 12th of January 1928, the first woman executed in New York since 1899. Her execution was photographed by a journalist who smuggled a camera into the death chamber, and the image of Ruth dying in the electric chair appeared on the front page of the New York Daily News, becoming one of the most infamous crime photographs of the era. What makes Ruth Snyder's case relevant to the history of poison, according to Linda, is that although she ultimately killed her husband by bludgeoning, not poisoning, she tried poison first, multiple times, reflecting the persistent association between women, domestic murder, and poison. According to Linda, Ruth's failed poison attempts fit the pattern of historical Black Widow, cases where women used poison or attempted poison to escape marriages. The difference in Ruth's case was that modern forensic science and modern medicine meant that Albert survived the poison attempts, and Ruth had to resort to more violent and obvious methods that led quickly to her detection and execution. Let me tell you about how changing legal attitudes toward domestic violence have transformed how we interpret historical poison cases. According to research by Professor Carolyn B. Ramsey from the University of Colorado Law School, whose work on intimate partner homicide examines legal history, American and British courts, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, rarely accepted domestic violence as a defense or even as mitigation for women who killed their husbands, whether by poison or other means. The law viewed marriage as giving husbands authority over wives, and killing a husband was seen as rebellion against legitimate authority, regardless of how the husband had behaved. But beginning in the 1970s, according to Ramsey, feminist activism and changing social attitudes led to recognition of battered woman syndrome as a legal defense in some jurisdictions. Courts began to accept evidence that women who killed their abusers were acting in self-defense, even if the killing didn't meet traditional self-defense requirements of immediate threat. According to Ramsey, this legal evolution has led scholars to reconsider historical cases, looking at women who were executed for poisoning their husbands, and asking whether they were murderers or whether they were abuse victims who used the only means available to escape ongoing violence. According to Ramsey, applying modern understandings of domestic violence to historical cases is complicated. We can't definitively know whether a woman executed for poisoning her husband in 1850 was an abuse victim or a cold-blooded murderer. The historical record rarely preserves evidence of domestic violence because it was considered normal and private. But according to Ramsey, what we can say is that many women convicted of husband poisoning throughout history probably were abuse victims who saw no other way out, that the law's refusal to recognize their circumstances as justification or even mitigation meant they were punished for self-preservation, and that modern legal recognition of domestic violence as relevant to homicide cases represents progress toward justice, even as it comes too late for the women who were executed in earlier eras. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through centuries of poison accusations and poison truths, through the stories of women who definitely poisoned, and women who were falsely accused, through the complex realities of desperation, survival, injustice, and sometimes genuine crime. I hope these stories have moved you, have helped you understand the impossible positions that royal and ordinary women alike occupied in societies that gave them almost no legal power, yet blamed them when they used the few means available to them. Societies that feared women's knowledge of herbs and medicines, yet gave women responsibility for healing and cooking. Societies that trapped women in marriages they couldn't escape, yet executed them when they tried to escape through the only method that didn't require physical strength or legal authority. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in whatever safe space you've created for yourself, I want you to appreciate the freedoms you have. Freedoms that would have seemed miraculous to the women whose stories I've shared tonight. You can leave a relationship that doesn't serve you. You can divorce an abusive spouse without needing an act of parliament or risking execution. You have legal protections against domestic violence that didn't exist for most of human history. You can own property, sign contracts, support yourself financially, all things that married women couldn't do for most of history. You live in an era where if you die suddenly, your death will be investigated with forensic science, rather than wild speculation, where accusations of poisoning require actual evidence, rather than just suspicion and stereotype. These freedoms were built on the suffering of countless women across centuries, women like Agrippina, whose reputation was destroyed by poison accusations, whether or not she actually poisoned anyone, women like Catherine de' Medici, who was falsely accused of dozens of murders because she was Italian and powerful and female, women like Frances Howard, whose confession was probably coerced, women like Florence Maybrick, who was convicted more for adultery than for actual evidence of poisoning, women like Charlotte Bryant, who might have been guilty, but who was also poor and powerless and judged by standards that wealthy women escaped. And yes, women like the Marquise de Brinvilliers, who definitely did poison her family, reminding us that this isn't a simple story of innocent women and guilty accusers, but a complex reality where some women did commit terrible crimes, while many others were falsely accused, where desperation sometimes led to murder, and where political enemies weaponized poison accusations to destroy powerful women. The truth about royal women and poison, the truth I've tried to share with you tonight, is that it is not one truth but many truths existing simultaneously. Poison was used by some women to escape unbearable circumstances. Poison accusations were used against many women to delegitimize their power and destroy their reputations. Poison scares reflected genuine fear, but also moral panics about women's changing roles. Poison knowledge was passed down through generations of healers, but was seen as evidence of criminal intent when found in the hands of women who stood to benefit from someone's death. Historical poison cases reveal the brutality of legal systems that executed women on weak evidence, while also revealing genuine crimes that deserved punishment. Understanding this complexity, holding multiple truths simultaneously, is the only way to honestly examine this dark chapter of history. Sweet dreams, dear friends, and may you wake tomorrow with renewed appreciation for forensic science that can distinguish between poison and disease, for legal systems that require actual evidence rather than circumstantial suspicion, for medical knowledge that can identify natural causes of death, for social progress that gives women options beyond poison when trapped in terrible circumstances, and for the courage of all the women throughout history who survived impossible situations with whatever means they had available. Women who were blamed and condemned whether they were guilty or innocent. Women whose stories deserve to be remembered with complexity and compassion rather than simplistic judgment. Sleep well and remember that history is never as simple as villains and victims, that truth is always more complicated than legend, and that understanding the past requires us to ask hard questions about power, gender, justice, and survival.